Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Atlanta Ripper. Before we begin, find a place of absolute comfort. Settle into the softness of your blankets and let your body sink into the mattress. We are journeying back to the year 1911, in the heart of the American South. Atlanta, Georgia, was a city of red clay and rising ambitions, but it was also a place where the nights held a heavy, velvet silence. In May, the air turns thick with a humid heat that clings to the skin. It is in this atmosphere, where the magnolias bloom and the gas lamps flicker against the encroaching fog, that our story begins. Listen closely to the rhythm of the city long ago. Take a deep breath and let the modern world simply fade away. The Atlanta of 1911 was a landscape of deep contrasts. On the main streets, new electric lights hummed with a strange energy, casting a cold white glow over the brick storefronts. But a few blocks away, the world changed. Here, the illumination was provided by the soft, amber pulse of gaslight. The streets were often unpaved, turning into rivers of crimson mud when it rained and rising as a fine dust in the heat. In the Fourth Ward, the community was tight-knit and vibrant. People sat on their porches to catch a stray breeze, their laughter mingling with the distant whistle of the locomotives. It felt safe, a world of Sunday best and neighborly waves. But beneath this surface of progress, the shadows were growing longer, hiding a darkness the city was not yet prepared to name. On the night of Saturday, May 27, 1911, a woman named Rosa Trice was making her way home. She was a quiet, hard-working soul of 35 years, known to her neighbors as a person of steady habits. The evening was particularly stifling, the sky a charcoal gray heavy with the threat of a storm that refused to break. Rosa walked with a steady pace, her boots making a soft, rhythmic sound against the packed earth. She passed the familiar outlines of the fences and the fragrant, waxy leaves of the magnolia trees. To her, these streets were home. She knew every dip in the road and every creak of the gate hinges. But that night, the fog was different. It seemed to swirl with a predatory life of its own, blurring the lines between the trees and the sky. As Rosa neared her house, the world seemed to contract. The sounds of the city, the distant barking of a dog, the clatter of a late carriage, faded into a muffled hum. There is a specific kind of silence that precedes a tragedy, a moment where the wind holds its breath. In the deep shadows near the wooden fences, someone was waiting. We do not know if she felt a prickle of unease or if she heard a footfall behind her in the dust. The predator moved with a terrifying silence, a phantom in the 1911 mist. There was no outcry that reached the ears of the families sleeping just a few dozen yards away. The night simply folded around the event, keeping its secrets beneath the canopy of the old oak trees. The fog remained, thick and unmoving. When Sunday morning arrived on May 28th, the first light of dawn was a pale, watery yellow, illuminating the tragedy in the red clay. Rosa Trice was found not far from her own doorstep. The wound to her throat was precise, a chilling display of intent that would soon haunt the dreams of every citizen in Atlanta. The news spread through the district like a cold draft. Neighbors gathered in hushed groups, their faces etched with a mixture of grief and a new, sharp edge of fear. The police arrived, their boots clicking on the pavement, but they were looking for a motive they could understand, a personal grudge or a thief. They did not yet realize they were standing at the beginning of a long, dark corridor of violence. The city's innocence was beginning to bleed away. The death of Rosa Trice was the opening note of a somber melody. As the sun rose higher that day, drying the dew on the peach trees, the city tried to return to its routines. But the air had changed. The fog of May 1911 did not truly dissipate. It lingered in the corners of the mind, a reminder that the dark was no longer empty. We leave Rosa there, in the quiet memory of a Sunday morning, as we prepare to follow the trail of the one the papers would call the Ripper. For now, let the images fade into the soft gray of the mist. Breathe slowly and feel the safety of the present moment as the echoes of the past grow dim. The night is long, but for now, you are safe in the stillness. Close your eyes. The red clay of Georgia has a memory. It is thick, heavy, and stained with the iron of the earth, clinging to the boots of those who walk the unpaved paths of the Pittsburgh neighborhood. After the body of Rosa Trice was found on that cold January night in 1911, the soil seemed to hold onto the secret of her final moments. The investigators had looked at the ground near Gardner Street, noting the way the earth had been disturbed, the way her body had been dragged through the damp winter brush. For a few months, the city tried to convince itself that the violence was a singular tragedy, a flash of cruelty born of a private grudge. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the scent of wood smoke and the distant whistle of the Southern Railway, but the earth was merely waiting. The spring of 1911 arrived with a deceptive softness, bringing the bloom of dogwoods and the rising heat that makes the Atlanta air feel like a damp wool blanket. It was on the 20th of May that the illusion of safety finally shattered. Belle Walker, a woman known for her steady hands as a cook in a local home, had not returned to her house on Garibaldi Street. Her sister, fueled by a rising tide of worry, stepped out into the morning light to find her. She did not have to go far. Only 25 yards from their doorstep, Belle lay in the shadows. The scene was a gruesome echo of the winter past. Her throat had been cut with a jagged, clinical precision, and her life had bled out into the thirsty red clay. There were no witnesses, no discarded weapons, and no clear motive beyond the act itself. As the news of Belle Walker's death rippled through the streets, a cold realization began to take root in the minds of the people. This was not a random act of passion. The similarities were too deliberate to ignore. Like Rosa Trice, Belle had been a young woman of color, a hard worker, someone who moved through the city with purpose. The press began to whisper of a black butcher, a shadow that moved through the dark outskirts where the street lamps failed to reach. The police were at a loss, searching for footprints in the soft dirt that seemed to vanish into the thin air. The realization of a pattern is a slow, agonizing process, like watching a storm cloud gather on the horizon and knowing that the first drop of rain is only the beginning of a deluge. Before the city could even process the loss of Belle, the shadow struck again. On the 15th of June, less than 3 weeks later, the red clay claimed another daughter. Addie Watts was discovered in the thick shrubbery near the intersection of Krog and DeKalb Streets, a place where the city's industrial heart beats against the quiet of the residential fringes. This location was near the Southern Railway, a labyrinth of iron tracks and wooden ties that hummed with the constant motion of freight. Addie's end had been particularly violent. Her head had been struck with a heavy railroad coupling pin, a tool of the tracks used as a weapon of opportunity. Then, with the same terrifying signature, her throat had been slashed. The perpetrator had dragged her body into the bushes, leaving her to be found in the gray light of dawn. The geography of these crimes began to form a map of terror. The killer seemed to favor the places where the light died, the alleys behind the grand houses of Inman Park, the edges of Grant Park, and the desolate stretches near the rail lines. Domestic workers, the women who cooked the meals and cleaned the linens of Atlanta's wealthy families, were the most vulnerable. They walked home in the late hours, their footsteps echoing on the hard-packed earth as they transitioned from the illuminated world of their employers to the deepening shadows of their own neighborhoods. Every rustle of a leaf, every creak of a porch swing, became a potential threat. The Atlanta Constitution and the Journal began to use a name that sent a shiver through the soul: the Atlanta Ripper. The comparison to the Monster of London was inescapable. By the end of June, the pattern was no longer a theory, it was a visceral reality. The red clay was no longer just soil, it was a canvas of evidence that the police struggled to read. They looked at the drag marks, the specific way the victims were posed, and the lack of robbery as a motive. The killer wanted the life, the blood, and the fear. As the summer heat intensified, so did the collective breath-holding of a community that felt abandoned by the law. The dark outskirts of Atlanta became a no-man's land after the sun dipped below the pines. The story of Addie Watts and Belle Walker was just the opening movement of a long, dark symphony that was only beginning to play out across the Georgia earth. The heat of July in Georgia is not a mere temperature. It is a physical weight. In 1911, that weight was compounded by a stillness that felt unnatural. The red clay of Atlanta, usually kicked up into a fine, choking dust by the passing of wagons, had become a parched crust under the unrelenting sun. In the neighborhoods of the old Fourth Ward, the air hung thick with the scent of overripe fruit and the iron-rich musk of the earth. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the warmth did not provide comfort. Instead, it felt like a shroud. The cicadas buzzed in a rhythmic, frantic drone that mirrored the rising pulse of a city on edge. This was the summer of whispers, where evening chatter on front porches was replaced by the sound of heavy bolts sliding into place. Fear had become the primary resident of the African American community, moving through the narrow alleys like a phantom. By the time the calendar turned to July, the patterns were no longer avoidable. The women of Atlanta, the cooks and laundresses who were the backbone of the city, found themselves looking over their shoulders at every footfall. They remembered Belle Walker in May and whispered about Addie Watts in June. The terror was a collective, heavy thing, a communal breath held tight. In the local markets and on the steps of the churches, the talk was no longer of the harvest. It was of the shadow that walked like a man but acted like a monster. The name Jack the Ripper began to migrate across the Atlantic, spoken in hushed tones as a terrifying and visceral comparison. In the middle of this sweltering season, the memory of Maggie Brooks returned to haunt the public consciousness. Though her body had been found in the autumn of 1910, her death now served as a grim foundation for the horror of 1911. Maggie was only 23 years old, a cook who had been making her way through the world with quiet dignity. Her discovery near the intersection of Hill Street and the railroad tracks had been a brutal omen. It was there, amidst the soot and the iron rails of the West Point line, that the signature of the killer had first truly crystallized. Maggie had not been merely killed, she had been broken. Her skull was fractured with a blunt force that suggested a sudden, violent ambush. A rock or heavy brick, used to silence her before the final, terrible act. The discovery of Maggie Brooks provided the first clues into the killer's method, a method that was now being repeated with chilling precision. The signature was unmistakable, a heavy blow to the head followed by a deep, ear-to-ear slash of the throat. But there were other, more peculiar details that emerged in the whispers of the neighborhood. There were stories of shoes being removed from the victims, of clothing being cut away with surgical or butcher-like intent, and of bodies being dragged into the tall weeds of vacant lots to hide them from the immediate gaze of passers-by. These were not random acts of passion. They were the calculated movements of someone who found a dark satisfaction in the ritual. The red clay around the railroad tracks often bore the marks of these struggles, scuff marks and heavy prints soaking into the thirsty Georgia soil. As the heat intensified, so did the frustration with the city's authorities. The police department, largely preoccupied with the concerns of the affluent white districts, seemed slow to grasp the magnitude of the predator in their midst. While white newspapers were filled with stories of social engagements, the black community faced a literal existential threat. The disparity in protection was a wound as deep as any left by a blade. Reverend Henry Hugh Proctor and other community leaders began to call for action, demanding that the lives of these women be treated with urgency. They petitioned for black detectives, men who could walk the streets of the old Fourth Ward without the barrier of mistrust. But the pleas often fell on deaf ears, leaving the residents to form their own informal watches, keeping lanterns lit late into the night for safety. By the night of July 3rd, 1911, the toll had reached a breaking point. The news of the eighth victim sent a shockwave through the city that even the most indifferent observer could no longer ignore. The summer of whispers was turning into a summer of outcry. Women who had once walked home from their shifts now refused to move after sunset. The economic ripples of the fear began to touch the white households, as the silence in the kitchens forced the reality of the Ripper into the light. The predator was no longer just a ghost of the alleys. He was a force grinding the city's daily life to a halt. In the darkness of the Georgia night, the only sound was the distant whistle of the trains, a sound that Maggie Brooks had heard in her final moments, signaling another night of terror. The transition from the sweltering heat of July to the cooling, heavy air of autumn in 1911 brought no relief to the city of Atlanta. Instead, the shorter days only served to lengthen the shadows where the predator lived. The atmosphere was thick with a strange, stagnant humidity that seemed to cling to the brickwork and the unpaved alleyways of the South Side. By now, the toll of the lost had become a heavy weight upon the shoulders of every resident. The city was a place divided by the sun and the moon. In the daylight, life hummed with the ambition of the New South, but as the golden hour faded, a different reality took hold. It was a reality of bolted doors and whispered warnings. The nights were quiet, but it was a brittle silence, easily shattered by the rhythmic tapping of a night watchman's stick or the distant, lonely whistle of a locomotive cutting through the dark. Imagine, if you will, the limited sight of the men tasked with guarding these streets. In 1911, the night watchman and the few patrolmen on the beat did not have the luxury of electric floodlights or powerful flashlights. Their primary tool was the bullseye lantern. It was a heavy, tin-cased device that burned kerosene, emitting a sharp, oily scent that mingled with the damp earth. The lantern featured a thick, convex glass lens designed to focus the flickering flame into a single, concentrated ray. This narrow beam was meant to pierce the gloom, but it was a deceptive ally. To a watchman walking the pitch-black corridors of the industrial districts, the light only revealed a tiny, circular patch of the world at a time. Beyond that circle, the darkness felt even more absolute, a wall of ink that seemed to pulse with every movement of the hand. It was through this pinhole of light that the city tried to catch a ghost. On the night of Minnie Williams' disappearance, the limitations of these tools became painfully clear. Minnie was a young woman whose life was woven into the fabric of the community, yet the path she walked that evening was fraught with unseen dangers. As she moved through the alleyways, the city around her was a maze of deep recesses and uneven ground. The alleyways were not the paved thoroughfares we know today. They were narrow, rutted tracks of dirt and coal dust, hemmed in by the high, windowless walls of warehouses and the sagging fences of vacant lots. Without the benefit of street lamps, these passages were essentially black holes. A person could be standing 5 feet away, perfectly still in the shadow of a doorway, and remain completely invisible to anyone passing by. Minnie's footsteps would have been the only sound, a soft thud of leather on earth, moving toward a destination she would never reach. When the sun finally rose on the morning of November 10th, the grim discovery was made near the corner of Georgia Avenue. Minnie Williams was found in a field, the victim of a violence so precise and so sudden that it defied the logic of the local authorities. She had been bludgeoned with a heavy rock, and her throat had been cut with the same chilling accuracy seen in the earlier murders. But there was a new, macabre detail that sent a fresh wave of horror through the investigators. Her right index finger had been removed at the middle joint, and her shoes were missing. The removal of the shoes was a strange, repetitive signature that began to emerge in these cases, suggesting a ritualistic element that the police were ill-equipped to understand. They stood over her in the morning light, their lanterns now extinguished and useless, looking at a crime scene that was already being trampled by curious onlookers. The forensic science of 1911 was a primitive and frustrating discipline. While the world was beginning to hear of the wonders of fingerprinting, the Atlanta Police Department still relied heavily on the Bertillon system. This method involved taking intricate physical measurements of a suspect's body. The length of the arm, the width of the head, the size of the left foot, based on the belief that no two people shared the exact same dimensions. It was a system designed for identification, not for solving the mystery of a silent killer who left no witnesses. There was no such thing as crime scene tape to preserve the integrity of the ground. Officers would walk through the very areas where the killer had stood, inadvertently destroying footprints or blood spatters that might have told a story. They looked for physical clues with their eyes alone, searching for a dropped button or a torn piece of fabric, while the invisible evidence of the 20th century remained locked away from them. The investigation into Minnie's death was hampered by this lack of technical reach and a deep-seated reliance on circumstantial suspicion. Detectives and the coroner's jury struggled to piece together a timeline from the fragmentary reports of night watchmen who had seen nothing but shadows. The narrow beam of their lanterns had failed them. It had not caught the glint of a blade or the silhouette of a tall man in a broad-brimmed hat. Instead, the light had only shown them what was right in front of them after it was already too late. As the investigators moved from the field on Georgia Avenue back to the station, the realization began to sink in that they were hunting a shadow with a candle. The killer was not just moving through the physical darkness of the city. He was moving through the gaps in their knowledge, exploiting the very limitations of a world that was still learning how to see in the dark. The investigation into Minnie's death had hit a wall of bricks and silence, a literal reflection of the physical and social layout of the city. Decatur Street was the pulsing heart of the city's black life, a winding artery of commerce, music, and struggle. In the soft, hazy light of 1911, the street was paved with uneven cobblestones that caught the moisture of the humid Georgia nights. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the vibrant daytime bustle of market stalls and barber shops would give way to a heavy, expectant stillness. The gas lamps flickered with a low, rhythmic hiss, casting long, distorted shadows against the red brick tenements and the weathered wooden storefronts. To the casual observer from the affluent northern districts, this was simply a place of labor and shadow, but for those who lived here, every alleyway held a story. Now, those stories were being rewritten in blood. The humid air carried the scent of coal smoke and the metallic clang of the railroad tracks, creating a sensory labyrinth where a predator could move unseen, camouflaged by the very neglect that defined the neighborhood's boundaries. The divide was not merely a matter of geography. It was an invisible, ironclad law that governed every breath taken in the Gate City. Only 5 years earlier, the horrific race riots of 1906 had scarred the collective memory of the community, leaving a legacy of deep-seated distrust and mourning. The social landscape was fractured by the rigid structures of Jim Crow, where the color line was as sharp as the killer's blade. This segregation meant that the deaths occurring in the shadows of Decatur Street and the Old Fourth Ward were viewed through a lens of profound indifference by those in power, while the white-dominated neighborhoods to the north enjoyed the protection of a well-funded police force. The residents of the South Side were left to navigate a world where their safety was an afterthought. The systemic inequalities of the era acted as a shroud, shielding the Rippers' movements and ensuring that the cries for justice would have to travel twice as far to be heard. In the local press, the dehumanization of the victims was palpable and precise. Headlines in the major dailies often relegated these tragedies to small, back-page columns, using phrases like "Negro woman killed" or "no clue to slayer." The newspapers had taken to calling the area Dark Town, a moniker that served to distance the broader public from the humanity of the women who had been lost. These victims were not just statistics. They were laundresses, cooks, and mothers who supported the city's very infrastructure. Yet, The media's fascination with the sensational nature of the Atlanta Ripper name often overshadowed the specific lives that were being extinguished. By framing the killings as an inevitable consequence of the supposedly savage environment of the tenements, the press reinforced the idea that these lives were expendable. This narrative created a vacuum of urgency, allowing the investigation to languish in a state of perpetual, listless motion, while the body count continued to rise, and the predator grew bolder in the encroaching gloom. The investigative response was further hampered by the composition of the police department itself. In 1911, the Atlanta police force was 100% white, a demographic reality that created an insurmountable wall between the officers and the community they were tasked with protecting. Instead of employing forensic diligence, the detectives often fell back on tired stereotypes and moralistic crusades. Rather than hunting for a precise killer, the authorities spent much of their energy raiding blind tigers, the illegal saloons that dotted Decatur Street, and cracking down on what they called Saturday night violence. They seemed convinced that the murders were merely the result of internal brawls and drunken disputes, rather than the work of a calculated serial predator. This obsession with policing the morality of the Black community meant that physical evidence was frequently overlooked or discarded. The very institutions designed to provide security were instead preoccupied with social control, leaving the true monster free to roam the dark and choose his targets without any meaningful interference. Yet the community did not meet this indifference with silence. In the hallowed halls of the First Congregational Church, Reverend Henry Hugh Proctor and other prominent Black leaders organized mass meetings to demand action. They formed a citizens' committee, standing up in the face of danger to advocate for the safety of their families. They petitioned the mayor and the governor, begging for the employment of Black detectives who could navigate the neighborhoods with the trust and nuance that the white officers lacked. They understood that the solution lay in community intelligence and mutual respect, things the current system was unwilling to provide. These leaders held vigils and organized neighborhood watches, where men walked the streets with lanterns to escort women home from the trolley lines. Their efforts were a testament to the resilience and pride of a people who were forced to become their own protectors in a city that seemed to have forgotten them, demonstrating a courage that far outshone the official response from the City Hall. As the months of 1911 stretched on, the psychological weight of the terror became an almost physical presence. The vibrant nightlife of Decatur Street began to wither, replaced by a haunting, self-imposed curfew. The sound of a footfall on the pavement or the rustle of a heavy coat in the darkness was enough to send a chill through the bravest heart. Families huddled together behind locked doors, listening to the hum of the city and wondering if the Ripper was watching their windows from the shadows of the alleyway. The silence of the night was no longer peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that muffled the reality of a predator in their midst. The divide of Decatur Street was now a border of fear, a place where the sun set on a community that was fighting for its life, while the rest of the world looked away. The shadows were deep, the air was still, and the blade remained hidden, waiting for the next Saturday night to arrive with its cold and inevitable promise. You could feel the city holding its breath, waiting for a savior that was not coming from the police station, but from the strength of their own resolve in the dark. The year of 1911 was one of heavy, stagnant air and a growing, collective shiver that did not come from the weather. As the autumn months began to pull the warmth from the Georgia soil, the city of Atlanta found itself gripped by a story that refused to stay buried in the back pages of the newspapers. By the time the calendar turned toward the late months of that year, the name of the Atlanta Ripper was no longer a whispered rumor, but a looming, terrifying reality. The tall pines that rimmed the outskirts of the city, once symbols of the deep, quiet beauty of the South, began to feel like silent sentinels watching a predator move through the dark. The transition from the scorching summer into the crisp, biting air of October brought no relief, only a sharper edge to the fear that had settled over the community. Every evening, as the sun dipped behind the jagged skyline of the growing city, the shadows seemed to stretch just a little further, reaching out from the tree line toward the doorsteps of the unsuspecting. In the heart of this darkening timeline was the memory of Sadie Holly. Sadie was a young woman whose life was defined by the steady, rhythmic work of the local laundry, a staple of the labor that kept the city moving and humming. In the late hours of a warm evening, she disappeared into the shadows of South Prior Street, a place where the metallic tang of the railway lines always hung heavy in the air. While her tragedy had occurred in the heat of July, it was the late autumn analysis and the subsequent murders of 1911 that solidified her place as a symbol of the Ripper's calculated cruelty. To imagine Sadie is to imagine the flickering gas lamps of a city on the edge of the modern age, where the light only reached so far before being swallowed by the dense, unlit thickets and the iron ribs of the train tracks. She was a daughter of the community, a hard worker who likely thought the familiar path home was safe, never realizing that the Georgia pines held a secret that would soon haunt every household. When the workmen finally discovered her in a small gully near Atlanta Avenue, the scene was one of haunting stillness. It was the details of her passing that began to weave a pattern of terror for the investigators. A heavy rock, weighing perhaps 2 pounds and stained with the grim evidence of the struggle, lay nearby in the dirt. But it was the ritualistic elements that chilled the blood of those who stood in the tall grass that morning. Her throat had been slashed with a precision that hinted at a dark expertise, and most disturbingly, her shoes had been removed and taken. This strange, silent theft, the removal of a victim's footwear, became a signature that the public could no longer ignore. The Atlanta Constitution finally broke its silence, declaring on its front page that a reign of crime had gripped the city, and the name of the Ripper began to echo from every street corner, whispered in the markets, and shouted from the newsstands. The removal of the shoes felt like a trophy, a piece of the victim taken into the night, leaving the investigators with nothing but questions and a growing sense of helplessness. As the year progressed into October and November of 1911, the descriptions of the perpetrator began to take a consistent, spectral form in the minds of the citizens. Witness accounts, often ignored or brushed aside by an indifferent justice system, spoke of a tall, dark figure who seemed to possess the ability to blend into the very fabric of the night. This man was described as having broad shoulders and wearing a dark, heavy coat that seemed to absorb what little light remained of the street lamps. Perhaps most iconic was the mention of a broad-brimmed black hat, the shadow of which hid his features from those who caught a fleeting glimpse of him near the railway depots. He was a phantom of the pines, a man who moved with a slow, deliberate pace that suggested he was not afraid of being seen, but rather that he knew exactly how to vanish when the time came. Witnesses recalled the sound of his footsteps, soft, almost rhythmic, like the steady beat of a heart in the darkness. He did not run. He simply moved through the world as if he owned the night itself, a tall silhouette against the orange glow of the city's industry. The escalation reached a fever pitch as the autumn leaves began to carpet the ground near the West End. In October of 1911, the discovery of Eva Florence added another layer of desperation to the search. Like those before her, she was found in the transitional spaces of the city, the fields and the edges of the tracks where the urban sprawl met the untamed woods. The sound of the wind through the Georgia pines became a source of dread, as every rustle of the needles sounded like the heavy footfalls of the man in the broad-brimmed hat. The community in the Old Fourth Ward and the surrounding neighborhoods began to lock their doors well before the sun dipped below the horizon, and the vibrant social life of the evenings was replaced by a heavy, watchful silence. The railway lines, once a symbol of progress and connection, were now viewed as scars upon the landscape where the Ripper could emerge, strike, and disappear into the labyrinth of boxcars and soot-stained alleys. The fear was no longer just about the individual acts of violence, but about the realization that no one was truly watching over the women who walked these paths. By the time the frost began to settle on the iron rails of the Southern Railway in late 1911, the psychological weight of the Ripper had transformed the city. The tracks were now seen as corridors of death, shadowy pathways where a killer could travel for miles without ever being truly seen by the law. The smell of coal smoke and the distant, lonely whistle of the locomotives became the soundtrack to a nightmare that showed no signs of ending. People spoke of hearing footsteps in the pines, rhythmic and steady, matching the pace of those walking home alone. The mystery was no longer just about the crimes themselves, but about the terrifying invisibility of a monster who could walk among the thousands of residents, a man whose presence was felt in every dark alley and behind every swaying branch of the Georgia woods. As the year closed, the footsteps in the pines remained, a haunting reminder that the predator was still out there, waiting for the next long night to fall over the gate city. The air in Atlanta toward the end of 1911 did not just carry the scent of coal smoke and dried pine. It carried a silence that felt heavy, almost liquid in its thickness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the city underwent a transformation that was both physical and spiritual. In the neighborhoods of the old Fourth Ward and the crowded corridors of the district known as Beaver Slide, the typical evening clamor, the laughter from porches, the distant call of neighbors, was replaced by an unnatural stillness. The frost, which had begun to settle on the iron rails and the wooden slats of the fences, seemed to muffle the world, turning every footstep into a sharp, echoing intrusion. You could feel the eyes behind the shuttered windows, watching the pools of yellow light cast by the sputtering gas lamps. It was a time when the darkness was no longer just a period of rest, but a living, breathing entity that held the memory of the fallen. The night was a predator, and the residents knew its teeth. Because the official authorities seemed either unable or unwilling to stem the tide of blood, the community began to turn inward for protection. This gave rise to what many called the Night Watch. These were not men in blue uniforms with silver badges. They were fathers, brothers, and husbands who had seen enough of the city's indifference. They gathered on street corners as the shadows lengthened, clutching heavy wooden walking sticks or lanterns that flickered with a desperate orange glow. You might have heard the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the frozen earth, a steady cadence meant to signal to the hidden killer that the streets were no longer unguarded. They moved in small groups, their breath blooming in white plumes before them, their faces set in grim masks of determination. Every rustle of a dry leaf or creak of a distant gate caused them to pause, their hearts hammering against their ribs in the biting cold. They were the thin line between their families and a ghost. The psychological toll on the city's working women was perhaps the most profound of all. For the cooks, laundresses, and domestic servants who lived in the segregated quarters, but worked in the grand houses of Peachtree Street, the journey home became a gauntlet of terror. Many of these women, who had once walked miles in the moonlight without a second thought, now flatly refused to leave their places of employment after the sun had set. Great kitchens in the wealthy districts grew quiet and cold as servants stayed overnight on pallets or simply quit their positions rather than face the walk back to the old Fourth Ward. The economic machinery of the city began to grind with friction. On the streetcars, the usual chatter was gone, replaced by women sitting in tight clusters, their shawls pulled high over their faces, their knuckles white as they gripped their bags. Every man who entered the car was a suspect. Every shadow that passed the window was a potential end. In the church basements, leaders like Reverend Dr. Henry Hugh Proctor met under the dim light of oil lamps to discuss the safety of their flock. They spoke of rewards, of petitions to the governor, and of the fundamental right to walk the earth without being hunted. There was a growing, sharp resentment toward the police department, which had made high-profile arrests only to see the murders continue unabated. The people felt abandoned by the law, and that abandonment bred a specific kind of weary resilience. They shared stories of the attacker, descriptions of a tall, dark man in a broad-brimmed black hat who moved with the silence of a shadow. This figure became a folklore demon, a nightmare that could slip through locked doors and vanish into the mist of the Chattahoochee River. The air of the city felt thick with suspicion. Even long-time neighbors looked at one another with wary eyes, wondering if the monster lived in the house next door. As December arrived, the tally of the lost reached a staggering 15. 15 women, mostly young and neatly dressed, who had left their homes with dreams and returned as tragedies in the dust. The number 15 hung over the city like a shroud. It was not just a digit. It was 15 families broken, 15 empty chairs at the table, and 15 sets of footsteps that would never again be heard on the cobblestones. The atmosphere in the Beaver Slide district was particularly somber. The narrow alleys, normally vibrant with the sounds of life, were now corridors of silence where the only sound was the wind whistling through the cracks in the tenement walls. The silence was not peaceful. It was a pressurized, vibrating thing, a collective holding of breath. People slept with hatchets under their pillows and heavy bars across their doors, listening to the house settle, imagining that every pop of the timber was the footfall of the Ripper. The end of 1911 did not bring a sense of resolution, but rather a deepening of the dread. The winter solstice brought the longest nights of the year, and with them, the realization that the killer was still out there, weaving through the fog and the industrial smoke of the cotton mills. The night watch continued their patrols, their lanterns casting long, distorted shadows against the brick warehouses, but the sense of being hunted never truly faded. Atlanta had become a city of two worlds, one that moved in the bright, artificial light of the day, and one that existed in the terrifying, silent watch of the night. As the calendar turned, the people prayed for a spring that would bring safety, yet the shadow of the Ripper remained long and cold, stretched across the red clay of Georgia. The silence of the night watch was the only shield they had, and as we will see, even that shield was sometimes not enough to keep the darkness at bay. The turn of the year brought no relief to the city of Atlanta. As 1911 surrendered to the cold, biting winds of January 1912, the atmosphere in the streets remained thick with a paralyzing, invisible fog of suspicion. The winter solstice had passed, but the shadows it left behind seemed to have grown longer and more permanent. The community was no longer merely afraid. They were exhausted by the weight of a killer who moved like a phantom through their alleys. Every morning brought a fresh wave of anxiety, a collective holding of breath as people scanned the headlines for a name they hoped never to see. The police, meanwhile, were drowning in the rising tide of public outrage. They were men possessed by a singular, desperate need for a scapegoat, or a savior, or perhaps simply an end to the questions they could not answer. It was in this season of deep, frozen dread that the focus of the law finally narrowed, landing with crushing force upon a man named John Mace. John Mace was a man whose life was defined by the steady, rhythmic labor of the kitchen. He was a cook, a man used to the heat of the stove and the predictable demands of a working day, yet he soon found himself thrust into a far more intense and unforgiving fire. In January of 1912, following the brutal discovery of Pearl Williams, whose life had been taken in a manner all too familiar to the city, the police descended upon him. They brought him into the Central Precinct, a building that smelled of damp wool, stale tobacco, and the metallic tang of old radiator steam. Mace was not a man of high standing or great resources. He was one of many who lived in the fragile margins of a segregated city, and to the detectives, he looked like a solution. They didn't just see a suspect. They saw an opportunity to quiet the screaming voices of the press and the terrified whispers of the neighborhoods. The arrest was swift, but the process that followed would be a slow, agonizing unraveling of a man's spirit. The interrogation of John Mace was a masterclass in the psychological and physical pressure of the era. He was taken to a small, airless room in the bowels of the station, where the light from a single, unshaded electric bulb cast harsh, yellowed rays across the floorboards. There were no windows to mark the passage of time, only the ticking of a heavy wall clock that sounded like the steady fall of a gavel. For hours that bled into days, the detectives practiced what was then colloquially known as the third degree. They worked in shifts, their voices a constant, battering ram of accusation. When one man grew tired, another took his place, ensuring that Mace was never allowed the sanctuary of sleep or the clarity of silence. They leaned close, their faces inches from his, their breath heavy with the scent of coffee as they repeated the same questions over and over again, waiting for the moment the fatigue would finally crack his resolve. The evidence they presented to him was as thin as the winter ice on a puddle, yet in that room they spoke of it as if it were a mountain of iron. They pointed to a dark, dried stain on his coat, a blemish that Mace insisted was merely a remnant of his work in the kitchen, a splash of grease or blood from a piece of meat. To the investigators, however, it was a scarlet admission of guilt. They spoke of witnesses who claimed to have seen a man of his build near the shadows where Pearl Williams had met her end. These accounts were vague, born of the misty, poorly lit streets where every figure was a silhouette. Yet the detectives polished these fragments until they shone with the false brilliance of certainty. They told Mace that the city already knew he was the Ripper, that his neighbors had turned against him, and that his only path to a merciful end was to sign the papers they placed before him. They were weaving a cage out of circumstantial threads, and every hour he remained in that room, the bars grew tighter. Under the relentless weight of this treatment, the human mind begins to betray itself. Mace was denied water, denied rest, and subjected to a cacophony of threats and promises that blurred the line between the truth and the story the police wanted him to tell. He was a man drowning in a sea of hostile faces, and eventually he reached for the only life raft offered to him, a confession. It was a document written not in his words, but in the sterile, accusatory language of the law. He signed it with a trembling hand, a desperate act to make the noise stop, to finally be allowed to close his eyes and escape the burning glare of that single light bulb. When the news of the confession broke, a wave of relief washed over parts of Atlanta, but for many, a nagging, cold doubt remained. The murders had been so clinical, so elusive, and here was a simple cook caught in a web of contradictory witnesses and a bloodstain that could have been anything. As John Mace sat in his cell, the silence that followed the storm of his interrogation was deafening. He had provided the city with a name to hate, but the fear did not truly dissipate. Even as the police celebrated their victory, the real shadow of the Atlanta Ripper remained uncast, lingering in the dark corners of the city's conscience. The burden of suspicion had been placed on a man who had been broken into compliance, and as the nights continued to grow cold and long, many wondered if the true killer was still out there, watching the precinct lights from the safety of the trees. The story of John Mace was not an end, but a haunting chapter in a much larger tragedy, a reminder of how easily justice can be sacrificed on the altar of desperation. The frost continued to bite, the wind continued to howl, and the city waited, breathless, to see if the blood would truly stop flowing. For now, we leave the echo of the interrogation room behind, and we wait for the dawn. The Fulton County Courthouse in the year 1912 was a place where the air felt like a physical weight. Within those heavy stone walls, the heat of the Georgia summer seemed to collect and thicken, clinging to the dark oak benches and the high, vaulted ceilings. Imagine the scene for a moment. The gallery is packed with a restless, whispering crowd, their faces glistening with sweat as they fan themselves with folded newspapers. Above them, the rhythmic clicking of the ceiling fans provides a steady, hypnotic pulse, Yet it does little to stir the stifling humidity. In this chamber, the city sought a resolution to the nightmare that had haunted its streets for over a year. The trial of the man known as Henry Huff was supposed to be the moment the shadows were finally dispelled. He sat at the defense table, a 27-year-old laborer who found himself the focus of a city's collective rage and desperation. Every creak of the floorboards and every rustle of legal parchment felt amplified in the heavy silence that fell whenever the prosecutor stood to speak. The prosecution's case against Huff centered on the murder of Sadie Holly, a woman whose life had been taken with the same brutal precision that defined the Ripper's work. The evidence presented was like a series of fragmented snapshots. There were clothes found in Huff's home, trousers stained with blood and dirt up to the knees. There were the scratches on his arms, which the police interpreted as the marks of a desperate struggle. A cabman named Will Williams took the stand, his voice trembling slightly as he described seeing Huff and Holly together in his carriage on that fateful night, arguing as they disappeared into the darkness near the crime scene. It was a glimmer of hope for the families who had spent months in mourning, a sign that the law was finally closing its grip. But as the defense began its rebuttal, that glimmer began to flicker. Huff claimed the blood on his clothes was from a common scuffle in a pool room, a frequent occurrence in the rougher parts of the city. The scratches, he argued, were from his daily work. The certainty of the witnesses began to erode under the pressure of cross-examination, and the jury was left to weigh the heavy cost of a potential mistake. While Huff's fate hung in the balance, another name echoed through the halls of justice: Todd Henderson. He was 35 years old, arrested in a Decatur Street saloon after a man claimed to have seen him with Sadie Holly at a local drugstore on the night of her death. The investigation into Henderson was fueled by a different kind of circumstantial weight. Detectives discovered that on the morning after the murder, Henderson had visited a barber shop to have a razor sharpened. In the context of a killer who used blades with such horrifying efficiency, this detail felt like a confession. But the most chilling moment of the proceedings came when Emma Lou Sharp, a woman who had looked into the eyes of her own attacker and survived, was brought into the station. The room was deathly quiet as Henderson was made to speak. Upon hearing his voice, Emma Lou shrank back, a look of pure terror crossing her face. She told the authorities that if he was not the man, she was badly mistaken. Her reaction sent a shiver through the courtroom. Yet even this visceral identification was not enough to overcome the lack of physical proof, tying him to the specific wounds found on the victims. The legal proceedings were further complicated by the immense political pressure bearing down on the city. Prominent figures, including the founder of Coca-Cola, a sack handler, had offered a reward of $250 for the capture of the Ripper. The police were desperate to show results, leading to a flurry of arrests that often felt like a dragnet designed to catch anyone who fit a vague description. In the courtroom, the inconsistencies began to stack up like old, forgotten ledgers. One witness would describe a tall, powerful man, while another would speak of someone shorter and more slender. The signatures of the crimes themselves, the specific, surgical nature of the mutilations, did not always align with the backgrounds of the men in custody. The prosecution tried to weave these disparate threads into a single narrative of guilt, but the fabric was full of holes. By December of 1911, the jury had reached its decision regarding Henry Huff. To the shock of many and the quiet relief of others, he was found not guilty. The evidence was simply too thin to support a conviction for a crime so monstrous. The acquittal of Huff sent ripples of frustration through the city, and the case against Todd Henderson also began to dissolve. Without a confession or a weapon that could be definitively linked to the murders, the state was forced to let them go. The glimmer of justice that had shone so briefly in the courtroom was extinguished, replaced by a cold, nagging doubt. In March of 1912, the Fulton County grand jury took a startling turn. They released a report concluding that the concept of an Atlanta Ripper was, in their words, a myth. They argued that the murders were not the work of a single, coordinated predator, but rather a series of disconnected crimes committed by different men, driven by jealousy or local disputes. It was a convenient conclusion for a city government embarrassed by its own failure, but it did little to soothe the fears of the community. Even as they declared the Ripper a ghost, bodies continued to be found in the lonely alleys and vacant lots of the city, their throats cut in that same unmistakable fashion. One man, Charlie Owens, was eventually given a life sentence for the murder of his wife, a lassie, in April of 1912. The newspapers at the time vaguely attributed his conviction to the Ripper murders, but they never specified which ones. It felt like a desperate attempt to close a book that was still being written in blood. As the suspects walked free and the grand jury turned its back on the theory of a serial killer, the families of the victims were left in a vacuum of silence. The justice they sought had been teased and then snatched away, leaving behind only the sound of the wind through the Georgia pines and the uneasy feeling that the true monster was still out there, watching from the periphery of the light. The courtroom was empty now, the dust motes settling back onto the empty benches, but the story of the Atlanta Ripper was far from over. It lingered in the shadows, a dark thread woven into the very history of the city, waiting for the next chapter to begin. After the conviction of Charlie Owens in April of 1912, a strange, hollow silence began to settle over Atlanta. The press, which had once screamed with headlines of a black butcher, now carried the news of Owens' life sentence as if it were a final period on a long, bloody sentence. Yet, for those living in the shadows of the Fourth Ward, the period felt more like a comma. The spring of 1912 did not bring the full resolution many had prayed for. The grand jury had recently made a startling claim, declaring the Ripper himself to be a myth, a mere collection of unrelated crimes fueled by jealousy. To the families of the 20 or more victims, this dismissal felt like a erasure of their grief. They knew something unified, and dark had walked their streets. As the year 1912 progressed, the frenetic pace of the previous summer seemed to lose its momentum. The killings did not stop entirely, but the interval between the discovery of bodies began to widen significantly. It was as if the silhouette that had haunted the gaslight was slowly receding into a deep, impenetrable fog. In May of 1912, a 20th victim was reported, her body found in a secluded alleyway with the same hallmarks of brutality that had become the Ripper's signature. But by then, the public's attention was beginning to fracture. The city was changing, and the memory of the Saturday night terror was becoming a ghost that lived in the peripheries of the mind. The streets remained dangerous, but the specific, concentrated fear of a singular monster began to thin like cold morning smoke. The identity of this phantom remained an agonizing void. While men like Charlie Owens and Lucky Elliott were behind bars, many believed the true predator was still at large, perhaps watching from a distance as others took the blame for his handiwork. There is a chilling theory that the Ripper was never caught because he was a nomad of the shadows, a man who moved with the tides of industry or the railroads. By late 1912, he may have simply packed his secrets into a worn leather bag and boarded a train, vanishing into the vast stretches of the American South. In other cities, singular, brutal murders would occasionally mirror the Atlanta crimes, but without modern tools of forensics, these echoes were never officially linked. He became a traveler of the night, leaving behind a trail of grief. Alternatively, some investigators whispered that the killer had never left the city at all, but had been silenced by a different kind of fate. In the sweeping dragnets of 1911 and 1912, hundreds of men had been arrested for minor crimes, vagrancy, petty theft, or public intoxication. It is entirely possible that the man with the knife was swept up in one of these unrelated nets. He might have been sitting in a cold cell, serving a short sentence for a small offense, while the detectives outside searched for a demon. If he died while incarcerated, or if he was later executed for a separate, less publicized act of violence, his true nature would have remained buried beneath the weight of prison records. The Ripper would have been neutralized, his reign ended by a coincidence rather than justice. The fading silhouette of the Ripper also speaks to the tragedy of the era. The racial and social divides of early 20th century Atlanta meant that the lives of these women were often treated as secondary to the city's image of progress. As the murders slowed, the authorities were all too eager to close the books and move on. The physical evidence, the blood-stained clothing, the blunt stones, the jagged blades, was tucked away in boxes, gathering dust in the basements of the police station. The witnesses, once so certain of a tall, thin figure in a broad-brimmed hat, began to doubt their own memories. The monster was being dismantled, piece by piece, not by the law but by time. The terror was replaced by the mundane struggles of a new decade, leaving the mystery to rot. By the end of 1912, the Atlanta Ripper had transitioned from a current threat into a piece of dark folklore. The shadow had moved so far into the past that it was hard to tell where the truth ended and the legend began. Was he one man, or many? Was he a surgical expert or a disorganized drifter? These questions lingered like the scent of rain on hot pavement, never quite washing away the stain of what had happened. The city moved forward, building over the sites where the bodies had been found, but the earth held its secrets tight. The Ripper remained a ghost, a fading silhouette against the backdrop of a city that wanted to forget, but whose history was forever marked by the phantom who walked the night and never returned to the light. The year of 1912 drew to a close with a heavy and expectant silence. In the neighborhoods of Atlanta, where the red Georgia clay meets the edge of the railroad tracks, the frantic energy of the previous months began to settle like dust. For nearly 2 years, a shadow had moved through these streets, leaving behind a trail of grief that the official record could never quite contain. We look back now through the haze of over 100 years, past the tall buildings and the modern lights, to a time when the city was still a landscape of gas lanterns and the low, rhythmic churning of steam engines. The Atlanta Ripper had become more than a mere criminal. He was a ghost, a phantom that had vanished into the humid night air, leaving the city to grapple with the echoes of his passage. The fear that had once locked every door on a Saturday night began to transform into a somber, lingering memory. We must remember the names, for in their names lies the truth of the lives that were so abruptly interrupted. There was Belle Walker, found on a quiet Sunday morning in May of 1911. She was a cook, a woman with a life and a home on Garibaldi Street, only 25 yards away from where her journey ended. Imagine the scent of the morning air, the dew on the grass, and the sudden, sharp silence that fell over her sister's house when she did not return. Then there was Addie Watts, whose life was taken just 3 weeks later. She was found among the shrubbery near the Southern Railway, a place where the sounds of the trains usually provided a steady heartbeat to the neighborhood. These women were not just statistics or headlines in a newspaper. They were sisters, daughters, and neighbors who walked these paths with purpose until the darkness claimed them. The investigation was a tangled web of frustration and missed opportunities. By March of 1912, the authorities seemed exhausted by the hunt. A grand jury eventually reached a conclusion that felt like a betrayal to the families of the lost. They declared that the Atlanta Ripper was a myth, a collection of unrelated crimes committed by different men. They suggested that the similarity in the murders was a coincidence, or perhaps the result of a darker, societal rot. Yet, for those who lived through it, the patterns were too precise to be ignored. The way the victims were found, the specific nature of the wounds, and the terrifying consistency of the Saturday night attacks spoke of a singular, calculating mind. Whether it was one man or several, the weight of the unsolved mystery remained, a cold case that refused to be closed by simple decree. The atmosphere of that era is etched into the very soil of the city. If you close your eyes, you can almost feel the thick, heavy humidity of a Georgia summer night in 1911. The smell of coal smoke from the passing locomotives lingers in the air, mixing with the sweet scent of honeysuckle and the damp earth. The streetlights of that time did not provide the harsh, white glare we know today. They were soft, flickering circles of amber that left vast stretches of the sidewalk in deep, impenetrable shadow. In those shadows, the city's heart beat with a wary caution. The sound of a footfall on the pavement, the rustle of leaves in a vacant lot, or the distant whistle of a train became signals to hurry home. The red clay, which today is covered by layers of asphalt, was once the canvas upon which this tragedy was written, staining the hems of dresses and the soles of shoes. As the years turned into decades, the list of names grew longer, encompassing women like Mary Cates and Lena Sharp, and others whose identities were never fully recovered by history. Some estimates say 15 women were lost. Others believe the number was as high as 21. Each one was a person of dignity, often described by the papers of the time as neatly dressed and hardworking. They were the backbone of their communities, and their loss created a void that could never be filled. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that their stories were often pushed to the inner pages of the newspapers, overshadowed by the concerns of the affluent. But tonight, we bring them back into the light. We honor the quiet strength of those who continued to walk these streets, who cared for their families, and who kept the memory of the fallen alive when the world chose to forget. Now, the streets of Atlanta are different. The red clay is buried, and the gas lights have been replaced by the steady hum of electricity. The phantom of the Ripper has retreated into the archives, a series of yellowing pages and faded ink that tell a story of a mystery never solved. The secrets of 1911 and 1912 remain held within the old brick walls and the rustling trees of the historic Oakland Cemetery. But as we reflect on these shadows, we also find a sense of peace. The world has moved on, and the danger of that distant time has long since passed. The women who were lost are no longer defined by the darkness that took them, but by the light they brought to their world while they were here. Their names are a soft murmur in the wind, a reminder of a history that shaped the city we see today. As the narrative of the Atlanta Ripper finally fades into the background, it is time for you to let go of the details. The mysteries of the past are settled in their resting places, and the questions that have no answers can be left behind. The night is still, and the room around you is filled with a gentle, protective calm. You are here, in the present, surrounded by the safety of your own space. The echoes of the old railroad tracks and the flickering lanterns are nothing more than a story told to help the mind unwind. Let the tension leave your shoulders, and feel the weight of your body sinking into the softness of your bed. The world outside is quiet, and there is nothing left for you to do but drift into a deep and restorative rest. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.